Thank you all for coming. I think in a lot of ways it's Easter weekend, so it's really kind of a fun time. But I do appreciate you taking your time out of a Saturday to come and hear this. This is a book on traditions in Boston, and it's one of the series that I've been doing. Fonthill is owned by Alan Sutton, who started the Arcadia series, and they even did 2 books here on Osterville. He started a group called Fonthill. It's in London, and he does primarily then and now books, but they're in color, and they're beautifully done. I suggested doing different types of things because, yes, I can follow the format, and I have been doing books on the Then and Now series, but I started this, which actually started Christmas traditions in Boston, and I did that here at the library. I've also done Thanksgiving, Valentine's Day, Easter, and Halloween comes out this fall. And what they are things of our shared memories of what we did as children and our parents on whatever the holiday was. So this was a book on Easter that I was fascinated with because Easter was a big celebration in our family. Half Italian, a quarter Irish, and a quarter English. The Irish and the English, not so much, but the Italian took it very seriously. It was not a secular holiday, it was a very religious holiday. But there were also wonderful things such as breads, as well as sweet bread, as well as also pizza gana and different types of foods that were only served on Easter. So when I did this, in some ways, I collected a series of photographs that would actually touch upon this from the period of only the 18th century in the United States to the present. And the cover, which were 3 little girls looking at their Easter baskets with coveted eyes, began to realize in some ways this was the ideal of mid-20th century America. Their Easter bonnets, beautiful frocks, as well as candy that would include not only dyed eggs, but chocolate and all sorts of things, including jelly beans. Well, this was truly something in a lot of ways that I realized that I was actually not going to be able to advance, but realized that it was going to be split into 2 sections. There would be a religious portion, but there would also be things that we talked about of the Easter bunny, as well as candies and flowers. During the week before Easter, it's a very detailed time in some ways of the 40 days of Lent. And beginning on Ash Wednesday, we actually, anyone who's an observant Christian, realizes in some ways that it's a very important part of the season in the religious calendar. In some of the paintings that I would choose, they began in that period that would actually show this, Christ carrying the cross. This was painted in 1505 by Andrea Solario, and it shows a very detailed portrait of Jesus Christ, not only with the crown of thorns, but also carrying that cross, of which he would actually be crucified upon on Good Friday, just like today. But this is an important piece because it depicted Jesus Christ carrying that cross with the crown of thorns to his crucifixion. But the emotional aspect of this powerful image is given added force by the introduction of the new dramatic language of expression and gesture with the anguish on the tear-stained face of Jesus Christ. In that way, many of these individual paintings lead up during that Holy Week to, of course, Easter Sunday. And seen here, Christ before the High Priest was painted in 1617 by Gerhard von Horst, when Christ was brought before the high priest by Roman soldiers and was questioned about his teachings and false testimony that was called against him. Looking at this, the detail is the candle, and the faces are illuminated between the questioner and Jesus Christ providing the answers. Jesus Christ with the crown of thorns was painted in 1635 by Matthias Stom, a member of the Caravaggists, a well-known grouping of Italian artists. And Stom, like his mentor Caravaggio, painted with naturalism and drama high in their pictorial subjects. This masterful painting depicts Jesus Christ in a nighttime scene of torment, illuminated by a single candle held by the man on the right, creating a strong effect of light and dark, good and evil. And of course, Jesus here, Christ and Thorns, was painted in 1818 by Karl Bloch. This is probably one of the most evocative paintings I've ever seen, and it's in Germany, but it shows Jesus looking directly at the viewer And we realize in this instance that this week was something that would be chronicled right up to the Christ crucified, painted in 1632 by Diego Velázquez. And this painting by Velázquez depicts Jesus Christ with a gentle halo enveloping his head, his lower head, nailed to the cross, and his feet together and supported on a little wooden brace in a classic contrapposto posture. In that instance, many people realize that eventually on Easter Sunday, the resurrection, if one is a believer in Christian teaching, would actually be painted again in 1881 by Karl Bloch, a man who did hundreds of paintings just on religious scenes, showing Jesus emerging from the tomb. Jesus Christ is victorious over death and emerges from his tombs with adoring angels and white lilies by the tomb, meaning purity or pure of soul. Well, in this way, it was something in a lot of ways that during the period of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, these paintings truly depicted what was written in the Bible. A painting was more than just a painting. It was something that told a story. Many people were illiterate, and though the teachings were usually told, it was also something that would actually see both paintings and stained glass windows giving the story that one could follow. Well, this was something that was not brought to the New World. The Puritans and the Pilgrims who settled what is now the United States in 1620 and 1630 were a grouping of people that were not people that actually talked about anything that was Roman Catholic or even Catholic in its interpretation. They themselves had meeting houses, not places of worship. They weren't churches. But they also, in some ways, wouldn't see the celebration of Easter until the period of 1689. At that point, the Glorious Revolution was something that brought King William and Queen Mary to the throne of England. And through them, there began a lessening of the barriers and restrictions in Massachusetts Bay Colony towards not just religion, but the celebration of religious holidays by the observant. Well, because the Anglican Church would be translated to the colonies, which today is American Episcopalianism, would actually be something that began to allow it. William and Mary would actually see this as something that would be celebrated in, of all places, a place of Protestant worship. Now, during the period between 1689 and 1728, the king's representative in the colonies would be called a royal governor. And Massachusetts Bay Colony had, during that period, Royal Governor Sir Edmund Andros, and he represented the king and the queen and actually carried out their wishes. Seen here, he was appointed royal governor of the Dominion of New England in 1686, and it restricted town meetings, restored the papist holidays, celebrated royal holidays, and allowed a maypole, of all things, to be set up in Charlestown and appropriated a Puritan meeting house for the Church of England services. And through these actions became one of the most vilified persons in Boston. What they did was to take the Old South Meeting House, a bastion of Calvinist Orthodox congregational faith, and take this for worship on Easter Sunday morning in 1689. It was something that was unheard of. And by doing this, what they did was to create a schism. So there were the Anglicans, or the people that adhered to what basically was the teachings of the Anglican Church and the King and the Queen. And then there were the Puritans, the people that actually couldn't put up with this, but had to because the royal governor was instituting the decree of the King and the Queen. The second place of worship for Easter would actually be the King's Chapel. And of course, that was only built in 1746. But in that instance, these were the two beginnings of what we saw of worship of Easter at that period. One of the people who was totally against this was my own ancestor, Samuel Sewall. He was a judge in the province of Massachusetts Bay and was said to have crossed out all the papist holidays in his journals. And he said, quote, "I blotted against February 14th, Valentine, March 25th, the Annunciation of the Blessed Virgin, April 24th, Easter, September 29th, Michaelmas, and December 25th, Christmas, and no more." He did not celebrate these because he was a Puritan. He was a member of the Church of England, but he wanted to purify that church from within. And in this way, he was the antithesis of certain Menandros. Well, this was something that was a dicey situation. And up until the Revolution, it was constantly back and forth. But after the Revolution, we began to see Boston changing. And in the 19th century, many people coming to Boston were coming from not only the Western European countries, but they were Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales, and France and Germany. And one of the German immigrants seen here was a man named Louis Prang. Prang was a German immigrant that came in 1848. And though he was an immigrant, he did have the trade of printing. And he began to print in Boston in the 1850s and 60s, but he became a lithographer, which meant that what he did was to carve stone in such a way that when it was dipped into whatever the color that was to be adhered to paper, each individual color would overlay to create a painting. And in that way, as a lithographer, he began to create some of the most well-known prints, or what he called lithographs of the day. He was somebody who said to have perfect color schemes as well as paper. And this, as you can see, it says Prang's Easter cards, was something that was a broadside, a huge piece that was usually put in a card shop where his cards were sold. And seen here with Jesus Christ, with the wonderful light of the sacred aspect, had also this wonderful wreath of Easter lilies. Well, Prang himself would produce in Roxbury not just the first Christmas card in the United States, but he was said to have produced among the first 3 Easter cards in the United States. He was somebody who knew his market. And during that period, he had over 140 employees in this factory. The building still stands off of Center Street on Roxbury Meeting House Hill, just up the hill from Dudley Street Station. And he hired, in some ways, a ratio of 60% women to 40% men. During that period, most of the men who made the paper as well as printed the cards would have women doing the designs. During that period, many of these women, some of whom were widows or spinsters, as he said, would actually make a career out of this. And he was somebody who would actually see in this instance beautiful cards that not only were religious, but in this instance, a cross with white Easter lilies. This was something done in 1868, just after the Civil War. So it was something in some ways that did have religious overtones, but it was also something that was a memorial in some ways for the hundreds of thousands of men who would die, both in the Union and the Confederate armies. Well, during this period, he also would offer all sorts of different prizes for people, both professional and amateur artists, who would actually submit designs that might become the card of the year. And this is a card that was done in 1882, and it's called The Angel at the Tomb of Christ. Now, this was something that would actually be done in a painting and then transmitted as a lithograph to a card. But it's probably, as it says, one of the most impressive chromolithographs that Louis Prang produced. Depicts an angel holding a palm frond and trumpet standing outside the open tomb of Jesus Christ. And there were 2 angels at the tomb of Jesus, one who rolled away the stone. They both helped Jesus from the tomb. And the palm frond is a symbol of victory, triumph, peace, and eternal life. He is risen and is on the tomb on the rock on the right-hand side. Well, this won a prize of over $2,000 for a man named Louis Smith, who was actually a well-known painter at that time. And $2,000 in 1882 would be equivalent today of close to $25,000. It was a tremendous sum of money. But Louis Prang had many people, as I said, doing these different designs, not just celebrity painters, but even the grouping of people that worked for him. And seen here with bluebells on the left-hand side, it says, "The bluebells of Easter ring over and over, holiest by for Christ, the Lord is risen, this is Resurrection Day." These were magnificent cards, and they weren't inexpensive. Louis Prang's cards could go anywhere from $1/4 to $2. Sounds ridiculous, But in the 1880s and 1890s, that was a tremendous sum of money. And in that way, Louis Prang was somebody who didn't just do religious cards, he also did secular cards. Now, I never questioned it, but maybe you did. How in heaven's name did a rabbit bring eggs on Easter? And I used to think in a lot of ways, it always seemed there was a rabbit around and there always seemed to be colored eggs, which we couldn't do because it would color our hands. But the idea was this was something that was brought by the German immigrants. And during the period of the 18th and 19th century, many rabbits who often used, as you can see, a pussy willow as a walking stick, would actually arrive with a basket of eggs. Nobody questioned it. I saw it when I did the book and I wondered. But seen here with the Easter Bunny, again by Prang, look in the foreground and you see an egg that's actually hatching with little chicks looking up at their mother, the hare. But the whole idea is this was beginning to see the division between religious and the secular interpretation of what Easter was in the United States. Well, in a lot of ways in the 20th century, there were many cards. I mean, it's so charming. I got one this morning from two sisters that I love dearly. And I was like, oh, this is so nice to receive a card on, Holy Friday. But I think in a lot of ways, during the 20th century, you might remember when our parents received hundreds of cards. Well, one woman that did this painting was Tasha Tudor. Tasha Tudor was a well-known painter, but she was also a writer. She wrote about her books that primarily dealt with her corgis, and her 100th anniversary was called Corgyville Dogs. Well, seen here in front of a portrait of her great-grandmother, Euphemia Tudor, who was the wife of Frederick Tudor, the Ice King of Boston, so you knew where their money came from. Ironically, it never melted, it increased. But she herself was somebody in a lot of ways that would actually write things like this, a card that would say Happy Easter, and she created an Easter egg tree, something that we see sometimes driving by here on Cape Cod. Not only did the children decorate this, but in the foreground, pots of wonderful spring plants. This was indicative of the secular interpretation of Easter. And Tasha Tudor would do these in some ways, and they were beautifully done, and today have become quite collectible. But you also began to realize that there were some major artists of the day. Does anybody recognize the man on the left? Exactly, Norman Rockwell. Norman Rockwell was the man who put the face of middle-class America in the 20th century. And he's talking with Joyce Hall. Joyce Hall founded Hallmark Cards. Do you remember the adage, if you care to send the very best? Well, we always bought Hallmark cards. My mother was somebody who followed that adage. But he was somebody in a lot of ways that didn't just do paintings, but he also worked for Hallmark Cards. And he made the most wonderful cards. Yeah, some were religious, but many of them were really quite fun. This is one that I love. And it's an iconic painting called Easter Morning. Now, do you see the man sitting on the chair, reading the newspaper, cigarette in hand? And it was the cover of the Saturday Evening Post edition of May 16th of 1959. And it depicts a father reading the Sunday newspaper as he crouches in his Eames chair with his wife and children in their Easter finery, clutching their Bibles, walking behind him to go to attend church. Sometimes I began to think in some ways this was something that was incredible. But look closely at Father. Not only do you see cigarette smoke, but do you see his hair? It almost looks like two horns. But look at the son on the right-hand side. Hey, Dad. I think in that way, this was something that I loved, and I was so glad to include it. But there was also a man named Edward Winslow Rust, and he started a company called Rust Craft. Now I go to my CPA, thankfully I did my taxes early this year, and she's near this place in Canton called Rust Craft Road. And Rust Craft had originally been in the south end of Boston. It actually had close to 300 employees, and they produced general mainstream cards. They later moved to Dedham, Massachusetts, and the types of things they did with this: Easter greeting to a special friend of mine, and a little kitten jumps out of a Tolware teapot. Charming. But Mary Cooper, you can see on the left-hand side, who actually did this, was somebody who had worked for Russ Craft for over 40 years. So there were typical things that were not just attractive and of course an Easter greeting, but there were some major heavy hitters. But there was also Norcross, what was known as the Webster card. Now, June Norcross was somebody, she and her brother, Arthur Dickinson Norcross, would produce cards beginning in 1924 in such a way that a lot of these were, again, mainstream cards. But they survived right through to the 1990s when they became part of Gibson greeting cards, just with Russ Craft as well. Well, cards were a major feature, and seen here by Norcross, an Easter lily on beautifully glazed paper. They invented the quarter fold. So if you fold a piece of paper in half and then again in half, you have a quarter fold. And that was something that gave not only a little sense of depth to the piece, but a beautiful card when you opened it would have a saying on the interior and a beautiful cover. Do you remember coloring Easter eggs? Well, during the period of the 20th century, one of the major features was a man who actually started this, Ira Fleck. Ira Fleck would actually produce colored pieces that you could then dip into water that you could place the eggs into. And they would create in this way all sorts of different colors. But Fleck also used this very saucy rabbit who not only has a top hat, but wears a morning suit. And I loved it because this began in 1889 and would continue right through to the 1960s. But one of the things is, as you can see, Flex was something that you would have glasses of water, and with that little bit of dye, you could create yellow, red, green, purple, blue, all sorts of different Easter colors. Now, I like this photograph because the woman with her apron actually has, in this instance, eggs that she's coloring. But look to the right of her face. Do you see the chick? The chick is on her shoulder watching her color the Easter eggs. Maybe that's her niece or nephew in that egg, who knows? But in that instance, Flex was something that would actually be supplanted by, of course, Rit coloring. And when I was a child, I can remember my mother having shoes dyed to match whatever the color dress. And Rit was something that offered shoe dye. But in this instance, Rit offered Easter egg coloring kits. And not only, as you can see them in the foreground, they actually have a small piece of cardboard with the 6 different colors, but you can also see the wonderful chicks and of course the Easter bunny. There's a dinosaur, as well as I think a monkey in the middle. But it was something that, again, with certified food colors, you too could have a wonderful assemblage of eggs on Easter morning. Well, this is a photograph. It's the grandchildren of my mother's very best friend, and I would say great-grandchildren. And they were actually coloring these eggs one day when I was visiting. And I began to realize in some ways that the eggs in the foreground aren't real, those are plastic. So they were coloring plastic eggs, but the thing was, I assume it was because the other eggs would have been used in cooking, but it was still quite a fun photograph. Easter bonnets. I don't think many of our female friends are going to be wearing Easter bonnets tomorrow. It's something that seems to have gone out of fashion. But in the mid-20th century, it was something that had continued from the early 19th century right through to the 1960s or 70s. No woman would ever enter a place of worship without a veil or a hat. And seen here, this woman herself begins to choose from dozens of different hats. But it didn't have to be a Milner. It could have even W.T. Grant, as well as Woolworths, that had a wonderful hat selection. So in some ways, it could be fanciful. She has a straw hat, a veil, daisies, there's even a carnation there. It was something that was beautiful, but it was probably only going to be worn on Easter Sunday. But then there were the people who went to Milner's, and this was somebody who was in Quincy Square. This is Mrs. Lemire. She was actually a woman. She's still alive. She's 98, lives in Florida, but she brought her son along. And you can see in the foreground, not only is she being fitted for an Easter hat, but he tries one on too. He threatened me one time on eBay and he said, if you ever publish that photograph, you know that I'm an attorney. And I said, should that concern me? And then when he found out that we knew each other, it was quite surprising. But that instant shows that hats were really quite an attractive thing. Not only did you look good, but you felt different. But you might actually have a hat that had straw directly above, made of plastic, and a real duck. This woman, I hope she's not wearing that for Easter Sunday services, but it's a little bit low. I do like the pearls, but she actually wears a real duck in her hat. And of course, there was also the Hat Sisters, who actually went between Boston and Provincetown on Cape Cod, surrounding Thomas Menino, then mayor of Boston, and they arrived in their spring hats and frocks. So you began to realize hats really did go the gamut, but they are something, again, that is somewhat lost in the mainstream. Now, services in a lot of ways aren't always just in churches on Sundays during Easter. We also began to see sunrise services, beginning in the mid part of the 18th century, primarily in Germany and France. But seen here in Melrose, Massachusetts, hundreds of people would show up, and this was something that was actually not shown, but listened to on WBZ radio. Easter Sunday morning Mass was something that attracted many people, and today it's done throughout the area. But seen here, there was also in South Boston at Castle Island, a Mass for Roman Catholics. This would attract thousands of people. And you can see the Donna McKay monument in the very center. An altar was set up in the very front of it, and you would actually see people at dawn on Easter Sunday morning, whether they were on a hilltop in Melrose or at Castle Island in South Boston. It was quite interesting. But there were also the traditional services that you might see at Trinity Church here in Boston's Copley Square, which would attract thousands of people, not only because it was magnificent in the interior, but it was usually an orchestral mass. You would also see here the Cathedral of the Holy Cross in Boston's South End being celebrated by Sean Cardinal O'Malley. Magnificent interior that's just been restored. Again, one of the most important organs in all of New England. And it was something just like Trinity that you began to realize that these were the traditional ways Easter was celebrated in the religious sense. But you could also go to a church that would have two angels on side of an electric board. And this electric board, surmounted by a cross, says, "Our Book of Golden Memories, Easter Offerings." And you actually see the church school classes with all of the different things that go from the cradle roll to the sunshine class and individual names. As the angel pointed to your name, and there's Miss V. Vozella, she would be asked to stand in the congregation and then to tell what her contribution was. What a way to bully someone into giving a large amount, and then it would appear in the amount column. It's also something I would never want to have done to myself. But you also began to realize that after services, people went for the Easter parade. And here, I assume two sisters on the right-hand side with one of the sisters' daughters and sons actually must have attended the Commonwealth Avenue parade. Now, the sisters are sensibly dressed and their shoes are very sensible, but the son is dressed in a morning coat and top hat, and the daughter in a magnificent fur piece, but each one of them have beautiful corsages in the manner boutonniere. Easter Sunday was a big deal, and so too wasn't the Easter Sunday parade. Along Commonwealth Avenue, and this actually dated back to the period just after World War I, thousands of people would actually walk from the Public Garden the entire length of the Commonwealth Avenue Mall to Kenmore Square. And it really incorporated people of all walks of life. The only adage was, in this instance, that you walk 4 abreast, so everyone else had to go around you. The man in the top hat is Christian Herder, who was the governor of the Commonwealth, his wife and their 2 children. They lived on Commonwealth Avenue, so they must have walked the entire length. But this was something that didn't just have a governor and many different elected officials. There were also women that would attend with their children. Now, I love this photograph. Look at that stone marten fur. The little daughter is nicely dressed, But look at her sons. Not only are they dressed in little morning jackets, but they have the Eton collar and a top hat. Now, those boys can't be any more than 5 and 7. I don't know why they put up with it, but the whole idea was this was a typical thing, and the photograph probably dated to 1935. During that period, there were also lots of groupings of women as well as men who would approach the Easter parade as something that was an annual ritual. And one of them was the O'Neill family of Jamaica Plain. Now, it was said here that the O'Neills wanted their daughters to be dressed in matching finery so that the family could stroll along the Commonwealth Avenue Mall in style alongside the Boston Brahmins who normally commanded the news. Now, Mrs. O'Neill is on the left-hand side with her husband just to her right. And we realize that she made all of these outfits beginning probably on Easter Monday for the next year. And you can see here, and this is 1957, that the O'Neills paraded along the Commonwealth Avenue Mall, having achieved local fame for not only participating in the Easter parade for so many years, but appearing in their matching Easter finery and gloves that their mother made annually for them. And from left to right are Jane O'Neill Deary, Barbara O'Neill Wampole, Maureen O'Neill Clunan, and Evelyn, Virginia, Julie, Danielle, Frances, and the last child to be born, Daniel Jr., and the husband and wife, Daniel and Julia Oliveira O'Neill. This is something in a lot of ways that went on for decades. And it wasn't just the O'Neills. We would also see this family from Somerville. And the woman on the left-hand side holding her youngest child did not sew these like Mrs. O'Neill. She went to a dressmaker. And as we see here, these were people who were the Houghtons. And this is something that was not only a fun thing, but they too rivaled the O'Neill family during that period. Seen on the Commonwealth Avenue Mall in their houndstooth cloak sleeve coats and white bonnets are, from left to right, Agnes Houghton, Rita, Maureen, Eileen, Kathleen, Sheila, Brenda, and Charles Houghton and Charles Houghton Jr. I guess they were Irish with all those names, Rita, Maureen, Eileen, Kathleen, Sheila. But that instance was something that would continue right through to the 1970s. And there was candy. Candy was something that no child could refuse. And seen here, this was the cover of the book that they colorized. It was a black and white photograph. But in their hats and their dresses and a basket in the foreground, this was the ideal of mid-20th century America. But they also did things even in public libraries. And this is the Brookline Public Library with an Easter egg tree. It was really just branches that were spray painted white, but the children would decorate it with the Easter eggs. It was an important feature to realize in this instance that even libraries were a place you could borrow books on the history of not just Easter, but the history of Easter eggs. And the candy included things such as SCHRAFFT'S chocolates. Does anybody remember SCHRAFFT'S? They were located at Sullivan Square in Charlestown, and William Schrafft was a German immigrant. Mary Ethel and I know his great-granddaughter, Kiki Neeland, who happened to be a Playboy bunny, but she herself could always talk about the history of SCHRAFFT'S chocolates. They made tons of chocolate every year, and they would provide boxes, as you see in the foreground, for every major holiday, as well as year-round as well. But seen here in her beautiful bonnet, as well as a sheaf of flowers, Easter candy was a major part. But so too wasn't Fanny Farmer candy. And Fanny Farmer, which had nothing to do with the Fanny Farmer of cooking fame, though they did use the name with a Y instead of IE, created in some ways a delicious candy that was sold in shops throughout the Boston area. And we realized even Whitman's chocolates, which is still available to this day, and we can see the man carrying a Whitman sampler of at least 40 different kinds of chocolate in a 1-pound box. It says it's the season's most popular messenger, and each one has a small rectangular piece of milk chocolate of the messenger of Whitman's chocolate. So in some ways, each of these were things that people could expect when you were a guest at somebody's home for Easter or to give to one's mother, aunts, or grandmother. During that period too, and we just received our Easter seal cards, was somebody that actually was well known as the woman that actually sponsored Easter seals in the late 1950s. That was Tenley Albright. Now, Tenley Albright had been born with polio. And during the period of the early 1950s, her father, who was a physician, would actually see her strengthening her legs and ankles in such a way that she skated at the Boston Skating Club in Allston. And during the period of the late 1950s, you had to realize this was a woman not only sponsoring Easter seals for crippled children, and mind you, that's her Porsche in the background, but she was somebody who attended Radcliffe College and was graduated from. And she also attended Harvard Medical School. And she became a very well-known surgeon in the United States. I knew her when I was on the board of the New England Baptist Hospital, and she was so unaffected and such a charming woman. But she did for 3 years what many people probably couldn't even do as a volunteer. And she would not only go out to meet the children who represented Easter seals, but she even gave a luncheon before Easter so that women could show off their Easter bonnets. And seen here, she won the raffle prize. And of course, the raffle prize happened to be a hat box with a hat that she's wearing. She was somebody in a lot of ways that was typical of that period of the mid 20th century, that not only saw Easter as something that was a secular as well as religious holiday, but another way through the Easter Seal program of raising money to actually benefit what we call crippled or handicap challenged children of today. Easter is also a time when family and friends come together to actually enjoy a wonderful meal. That communal aspect is something seen here, whether that's mother and father or their friends or family, but with not only a piece of meat, and this is a ham, but it could be a leg of lamb, it could be a turkey or a variety of things. Food is integral in the part of our tradition of how we celebrate Easter. My father was a vice president of Armour Meats for about 25 years, and we would always have a ham. And the ham, as you can see here, was something, their star ham was thought to be the best that was available. It was always studded with cloves, which I hated, but you had to do it because that's the way it was done. But in this instance, whether it was a star ham, or as you can see here, a chicken, that you can see here says an Easter salute to the noblest roaster of them all, that you could serve your bird's eye frozen vegetables with. So it could be a ham or a chicken, or in this instance, Julia Child would show us exactly how to roast a chicken for Easter Sunday. And look at the different chickens. And the word fowl always comes to mind in this instance. These were roasting chickens, and they really did go the gamut. Notice how they sit so perfectly for her. Of course, if somebody held a knife over our heads, what was our heads, we too would sit up straight. And there was also this child, which I had to include in the book. It's the freakiest photograph I think I've ever seen. Look at those eyes. I've only seen eyes like that once in my life, but she's looking at that piece of ham or those peas or those yams, and you're beginning to realize in some ways, covetousness is something that's actually in those eyes. With her glass of milk, she's ready for Easter dinner. But so too wouldn't be dessert something that people would see. This was Baker's chocolate, the oldest manufacturer of chocolate in what is today the United States. Begun in 1765 by Dr. James Hannon, we realize in that instance it would become in 1780 the House of Baker's chocolate. And this Easter egg cake, beautifully done with different layers, but in an oval covered in chocolate and jelly beans, it looked just like a chocolate egg. And there was also, as you can see here, Duff's gingerbread mix. Mixes was something that were quite unusual in the 20s and 30s and even the 40s. But Dorothy Duff would actually do something that you simply added milk, egg, and a little bit of oil. And you too could either make gingerbread, or you could actually make even a gingerbread cookie, such as this rabbit, along with Easter eggs that say Happy Easter. This was something that made her a millionaire. So Baker's chocolate, Duff's gingerbread mix, that would all lead up to that Easter parade. In this photograph of 1979, one of the very last that was held in Boston, you can see too, it was an early year, snow is on the ground, but people are still dressed beautifully on the Easter parade at the Commonwealth Avenue Mall. Well, this is a book in a lot of ways that really does incorporate many different things. But one of the things that I really did want to incorporate is Mrs. Mallet and her ducks. This is something that's actually in Boston's Public Garden, and it's dressed differently. So the day of the Red Sox opening, every single duck will have a jersey of the Red Sox with a cap. Christmas time, Thanksgiving time, whatever the year. But in this instance, they're dressed in their Easter finery. The bronze ducklings in the Public Garden in Boston was sculpted by Nancy Schoen as a recreation of the Mallet family in Robert McCloskey's children's classic, Make Way for Ducklings. In that way, this is something that not only shows the children many times that will sit on these ducks, but also how important this whole evolution of Easter is in Boston. So when I talk about Easter traditions in Boston, just like my other books on Christmas, Thanksgiving, Valentine's Day, and now in the fall, Halloween, each of them are shared memories of the things we remember that our grandparents, as well as our parents, have actually seen. But the whole aspect is, it's a wonderful tradition, but it's something in a lot of ways that I say to you, Happy Easter. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it.